a pleasurable thing.
Right, that's why it's the majority, you know.
And you keep saying the Greeks, but it was probably the Corinthians and not all Greeks, because they believed in true beauty, and their statues indicate beautiful bodies.
Right,
Statues
but
that you
think
see.
about, all right, when the gods or goddesses would take on a human form, it was not their real form. And the bodies were used by the gods and goddesses. Think to the Greek stories. By the gods and goddesses for their own pleasure. For instance, when you go back and you read all the different demigods, how we get demigods in Greek thought, what happened? You had a god or a goddess that wanted to give in to their lust, so they would assume a physical body of beauty for what purpose? For their own benefit. But the body didn't matter. And so this is a Greek thought. It's bigger than just Corinth. The Greek understanding of the body is that the body is evil because it's made up of matter. And now, when you contrast that with Christian thought, so if you have a Greek thought of body which is evil, and so if it's evil, then there's two schools that you can approach. You can either do whatever you want with it because it's going to be burned up anyways, or it's going to decay when you die, or you can abhor it and not do anything with it. Now, Christian thought is different. Christian thought is body and spirit are linked together. And so what you do with your body makes all the difference in the world.
But culture today, what you think they think?
Well, it's, you gotta, probably for us today is somewhere in here, if I had to guess.
I would say it's real important to
Right.
preserve it.
Well, I mean, because, I hope so.
I think that's
what.
Well,
I mean, tell me where you're going with that.
so what? That's what culture does.
Sure.
I mean, they make little kids think they've got to be skinny and firm
Right,
and
okay.
beautiful.
Yeah, so you would say,
And old people be young.
I mean, you would say that in our thought, Sally, would you say this is true of what you're getting at? Is that maybe today we're not a mixture of the two, but we're over here with body being of great importance.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I think it's talked about a lot more than
In spirit.
spirit.
Okay, now I'm all right with it. I mean, there is a lot to that. I mean, now there was a god of beauty, right? Maybe this is where Marilyn's getting at. Aphrodite also has a temple in Corinth. I mean, she's the goddess of sexuality, a god of beauty.
Is she famous? Yes.
In the Roman version, I mean, of course, we're in Greek understanding, but in Roman version, absolutely. So you do have this idea of of beauty there, but all of that was used for. I mean, it was just a means to an end to get whatever, or to justify whatever pleasures you wanted to endure. Does that make sense? I mean, the physical body was a means to get something, for lack of better words.
It's still there.
Oh, it is. I mean, so, we have a ton of people who bow down to the god or goddess of body. I mean, you can just turn on the TV.
Where does the mind fit into this?
Well, mine would be here. They would put mine in. Instead of saying spirit or soul or something like that, maybe physical, metaphysical. How about that?
If you're just doing bad things with your body, then it does bad things to your mind, or the other way around.
Yeah, now you're bringing in social sciences, which we don't get until the 1930s, okay? So this is we're not there yet. Give us about 1900 years. Yeah.
The next thing I was thinking about too is I have known one quite a long time ago and another one in this day and age, a young girl who, for whatever reason, they cut themselves. Are they doing that, is that a pleasurable thing, or is that
Okay, all right, this is a good question. Now, the question that comes up is, how do we deal with, that's not new, okay?
Really?
Oh, well, Mark chapter there's a part in Mark, I think it's Mark, and it's not, I want to say it's like maybe 8 or 9, and I'll investigate it at the break, where Jesus gets in the disciples and they leave from one area of the lake and they go to another area, and as soon as they land, there's a guy who lives in the tombs who is known for cutting himself. And he immediately comes up to Jesus, and and of course there's a whole story where the pigs and whatnot. So the idea of cutting oneself is not new. Pardon me? Oh, no. Now, in today's society, I would, if I had to just make some opinions from what I've observed and experienced in ministry, is that cutting takes place more today with females than with males. But cutting is a, and it probably stems a little bit from some self-hatred. All right. Yeah. Well, it's not punishment. I mean, don't see it. Hang on, just a second. Don't see it more so from punishment as much as there might have been something that has happened. Sometimes happened physically, and so cutting can be a pain reliever. And what I mean by that is, well, I mean, just name some pain relievers that exist in our society. Aspirin, is that what you said? You're being light, okay? I mean, all right, let's get beyond Tylenol and ibuprofen, alcohol, drugs. Glory, what's someone say?
I said Lortab.
Lortab. I mean, there are a ton of them. Anything that can alter the conscience, all right? That is our sense of consciousness. That's a pain reliever. I mean, one of the reasons why this shows up here. I mean, everybody who goes to the gym and works out to where they can't stand up anymore, it's not because they want their body to be healthy. I would probably say that some of their injuries stem from the fact that they have overexhausted their body. But, I mean, what happens when you work out? What does it release? Endorphins. Right. Right. Well, that makes you feel good. It's like eating chocolate. So, I mean, but, we'll talk about alcohol or drugs, but you've got this idea of, I don't want to do anything with my body, all right? Cutting, maybe even the idea of overworking out to the point of where it's causing physical, your health physically is not as strong as what it should be. I mean, you can run too much, right? I mean, you can. Eating, overeating, things like that. I mean, so there's, on one level, our society is not much different than the ancient society. We just have different terms that we put with it. I mean, one of the things that I hope that you've heard me say, the difference between the ancient world and our world is the ancient world was more honest. Now just sit with that for a second. You could walk down the street in Corinth and you would found a number of temples. Right? Think about in the book of Acts, is it 16 maybe? Don't hold me to 16, but it's in that area. Paul goes and he's listening to all the debate, and he's walking around the city, and he notices that they have a temple set up for everything, even a temple or an altar set up to the unknown God, just to cover their bases. Right, it's in Athens, and I think it's in 16 is Philippi, so it might be either just before or just after. So, but my point is, you could walk down the street and it was just known. And so if somebody wanted to go and worship at the temple of beauty or body, well, it had a name, okay? If they wanted to go and worship at the temple of this, or worship at the, they had a god of bread, they had a god for wine. I mean, there's a little bit of everything going on. And people would go and, they'd go and bow down in some form or fashion in a number of different ways. And it was just accepted. Now the difference for us is we hide it. I mean, we do. I mean, how many of your meals do you eat because it's just time to eat? You need to sustain your body. Most, yeah, well, I can tell you, when I get anxious, I like to eat. And, and I want to eat something that's normally not good for me. Or I want to overeat with a portion that's, I have a physical that's going to be tomorrow, and I'm waiting to hear, what I always hear is, all right, Shane, let's go over this again. This much protein, this much greens, I get it backwards. But, I mean, it's, it is what it is in our society. And, we're just not as honest or authentic as they were in the ancient world. But the temptations, when we say there's nothing new under the sun, we're not trying to say, all things are permissible. What we're saying is that what shows up in human nature back then shows up in human nature today. Okay? And we just have different terms or different titles or different ways of discussing it, but don't make any grand illusions that the temptations that manifested themselves in the ancient world, that either they don't manifest themselves in your life or in the lives of people around you, or that you've got something new that they didn't have. Okay? It's there. And it's it's just a part of living in the world that we live in. And so, but they were there back then, they were there here today. And the issue of the body, for them, was a big deal because they had a number of things that they were struggling with, particularly stemming from the idea that the body is made up of something that's physical. And anything that's made up of something that's physical is less than, not as important. It doesn't matter because I'm not doing a pun there. It's not a concern of theirs of any substance, because ultimately what's most important is something that's metaphysical. Metaphysical is what lives on in the afterlife, not the physical in the Greek thought. And now, just like it is in our society, there are going to be some pockets where things were more important or highlighted or whatever, more so than others. But generally speaking, that is a Greek understanding. Now, Christians, Judeo-Christian theology, their view of the body is the same. It is part of the whole person. So what is redeemed or what lives on in some form or fashion will be something physical as well. All right? And so one of the biggest stumbling blocks for the Greek world is the incarnation. Why?
That's not easy.
Right. And if God comes and really is physical, then he's got to be not a God. So often in Greek understanding, when it came there's actually a first century heresy called, it comes from the Greek word to see, or to appear, not to see, to appear, doceism. And the idea is that God really wasn't fully human in the incarnation, because in order to be fully human, he would have to be made up of matter, which means he would be evil. And so he just appeared to be human. Does that make sense? And of course it gets voted down fairly early. Because if you take out, if Christianity has said physical and metaphysical are linked together, that you can't separate them, but yet incarnation and Savior is only metaphysical, not really physical, what does that mean about the redemption of the physical side? Does that make sense? It means it's good luck. Flip a coin, whether or not it works. But I got puzzled looks. You understand what I mean by that? All right? If Christ is 100% physical, all right, but no metaphysical, then in the resurrection, what is resurrected? Just the physical? Well, then what does that mean for the metaphysical stuff? Well, it's just good luck. If Christ is only metaphysical but not physical, and dies and is resurrected, what's resurrected? Metaphysical. So what does that mean about the physical stuff? Good luck. So, incarnation, both physical and metaphysical.
Well, wasn't he reincarnated metaphysical? I mean, he could walk through doors and.
What's that? Reincarnated?
When he came back.
Yeah, or after,
When he was-
post-resurrection.
Yeah.
The idea of, was he physical? I mean, there are passages that talk about
I
being
know, but he couldn't
metaphysical
go through the door.
and physical. But there's also a passage that says, here, come touch me.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, you find, in the gospel, you find both.
He came back both.
Right. Somebody said something over here? Yeah, he ate, Thomas touched him, you know, I mean, so there are a number of things that, but what you find in the gospel is, in the total gospel, all the gospels, you find both physical and metaphysical.
But his physical was not evil.
No. Well, right, Judeo-Christian view is that matter is not evil, it's part of the creation. And so it's a different worldview, okay? And so you have to see the differences between Greek thought and Christian thought. One sees the idea that anything that is physical is evil. It's not important. It's very less than. It is. But with Christianity, they're both seen in high regard. Which means then when we talk about, now the reason why we're spending a great deal of time on this, because when this gets played out in the form of incarnation, we just talked about it, physical and metaphysical, when it talks about redemption of creation, I mean, what ultimately is redeemed by God? Is it just humans? Yeah, it's all of creation. When you go back and read some of the passages in the Old Testament, some of the prophetic passages, you know, Joel's a good example of this. It talks about redemption in creation terms. You know, the whole cosmos is redeemed. When you look in the book of Revelation, I mean, when you read particularly the very end of Revelation, where it gives a picture of life with God, it's not just people. I mean, what else is being described? It is creation terms. And so so when we play that out, if God is interested in the redemption of the entire cosmos, not just humanity, what does that mean for us with how we treat the cosmos?
We never,
Right. I mean,
that means dogs go to heaven.
Well, it says the lion lays down with the lamb, so it doesn't say dogs, but maybe lambs. That's, we can discuss that throughout church history. That's not answered specifically, but the idea of creation being redeemed is. I would say that anything that is created, has God's going to do something with it. That makes sense. All right? Now, that's not necessarily in chapter 7, so we kind of left the text a little bit. But great questions. But you can see how important this is, because the church in Corinth, even though they're dealing with the lion's portion of chapter 7 has to do with sexuality. It's 100%. What do we do with sexuality, sexual relationships? And Paul's just going to go through 7 or 8 different issues that are involved in that area at that specific time. But the larger question is, if physical is important and metaphysical is important, when that plays out into daily living, it does have consequences. Does that make sense? Like last week we talked about how we have in the Methodist Church theology or articles of religion, and we talk about our discipline of all things, right? And then, but then when you play that out into social activity, your theology is the lens by which you relate socially. And if you feel like the body is not important, then you can do whatever you want with it, with your own body. You can treat other people's bodies however you want. Does that make sense? So, if whatever your theological lens is, your view of God, all right, and close to that would be your view of self, and then your view of others. When that plays out into the world, that determines your behavior. people are not inconsistent, okay? They act consistently to what they believe. It is what it is. Now, you might not like what they do, and you might not know what they believe, but if you were to open them up, we are all consistent this way. You know, when people say, well, you know, Shane, man, he's acting out. This is just totally opposite of his character. You just didn't know Shane well enough. He kept that hidden from you. Right? But this, how you see God in some form or fashion relates to how you see yourself, other people, and it will determine your behavior.
But that can be changed over a period of time, right? Or do you always see the same character?
Well, I mean, now, you know, well, for instance, say at a certain age, you might have had a view of God that's this, okay? But you will be consistent to how that plays out in the world. Over time, your view of God might, you know, you might come to faith, or might come to, you know what I'm saying? Or down the road, it might even change to something, you know, change to that. All I'm saying is that whatever is in this box determines the other things.
Because you know, my thought was if that's what you are, you can't change. I mean, are you just always pretending?
No, what I'm saying is not that people can't change. They can change. What I'm saying is they will be consistent to whatever is in their box. Does that make sense? I mean,
What's in their box can change over time.
right, yeah, this can change, but when it does, that'll change.
Okay, yeah.
But what won't change is this process from here to here. That's what I'm getting at. Does that make sense? That's real important. Again, this doesn't show up in Corinth, in Corinthians, but you know, for instance, Jacob's a perfect example of this. Jacob changes. Right? What happens to Jacob? He has an altering experience, and his view here changes. So what does God, what's his name then? It's no longer Jacob, which was one way, now he's something else. But this has changed first. All right? But we believe people can change. We believe they can change because that can change. All right? Good question, man. Fantastic. All right. So, any comments or questions about at least the contextual environment of the Corinthians before we actually start looking at the specific text? Sure.
The struggle between mind and spirit.
Mhm.
We can't hear you. The struggle between mind and spirit that Shane was talking about and going on in his letter to the Corinthians is the same thing that brought it back tonight. With Paul being in Athens, when he tried to discuss and convert with the main schools of thought,
Right.
the Epicureans and the Stoics, and he left with no success because he couldn't get past the
Yeah, they had in their box was, she mentioned the Epicureans in Athens in the book of Acts. In their box was, you know, what's the cry of the Epicureans, you know? Eat, drink, and be merry, right? So, because tomorrow what? We die. That's right. So, you know, so this is how they viewed the world. This is their worldview with how they viewed afterlife, you know, and so that played out to how they acted, right? There's another group that he meets, and also in Athens. He also meets some others in Philippi. They have a certain view about God, and it determines how they act. Now, some of these are converted, and so their view changes to God. And then their behavior changes. The Philippian jailer. Remember that, Acts 16? All right? So he witnesses, you know, he is not, he has a different view. There's an earthquake. He realizes that Paul and the people that are with Paul are different. He inquires about that. They talk to him, and through the work of the Holy Spirit, he is converted. Well, then his behavior changes. Zacchaeus is another one in the Gospels, right? Zacchaeus, you know the song? I'm singing it. No, I'm just kidding. But Zacchaeus has one way of life. He is exposed and meets Jesus. His life changes. He comes down invites Jesus to his house for supper. In that conversation, his view changes. The core of, his box, to use what we're talking about today, changes so much so that when the supper was over, what does he tell Jesus? I will go back and make right what I've done wrong. So you see proof that his behavior has changed. This is, people are not inconsistent to what they believe.
That's all of us that come to that
Sure,
same point.
absolutely.
Where we override the views of the world and change and put God first and put him in the center of our life.
Right. There's whether or not when we talk about conversion, the conversion experience is like Paul, Damascus Road, one way, boom, totally changed, or whether or not it's, a process that we call process conversion over time. But eventually, when it comes to whoever is the center of their life, of their worldview, of their identity, that will ultimately determine how they function, how they behave. And that is, we can look at even in the Romans text about, when Paul is talking about the role of grace, and he gets into the role of predestination, and all that is centered around Christ. When that becomes in the box, what happens is, this will filter down into every aspect of your life, into your behavior. And when you read, if you do read the book of discipline, it's set up this way. Theology, belief, first. You read that first. And then the next thing you read is, okay, how might that play out in the world socially? Well, it might look like this. All right? Good question. All right, well, let's get into text. Let's somebody read, if you would read for us, 1 through 7. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 7.
I will.
Okay?
Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to judge a woman, but because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind.
Okay. Now, one thing you need to know also, in the writing of Corinth, right, at the time of Paul writing Corinthians, he was highly influenced by the idea that, and a number of people in the New Testament were influenced by this, that they literally thought the return of Christ was imminent, and that the end was near. And so when we start to look even further into chapter 7, and in chapter 8, you get a lot of that where he says, just be as I am, the end is near. So a little bit what's influencing Paul is this concept of, Christ is going to be coming back any day now. So if that is the case, then, we can, let's just wait for that. When he writes about family relationships and marital relationships in later books, it's the writing is a little bit different. And so what most scholars believe is that how prominent this was in influencing Paul's belief system might be waning just a hair, if that makes sense. And so, but Corinth is an early book compared to some, and so there is this impending understanding that Christ's return is very imminent, and if that is the case, if you're waiting to go, if when our study is up today, and somebody's going to come and pick you up and take you to lunch, you're going to act with the understanding that they're going to be arriving any minute, right? Which means that you might not do certain things. You know, you might wait and go get something to drink, or you might wait and, you know, instead of going by and giving some instruction to Kathy or to myself or to John, you know, everything is influenced by the fact that somebody's about to pick you up. So that's going to be the most important thing that influences you. And there is a thought that Paul specifically, and a number of other people in the New Testament really thought that the second coming was to happen fairly soon. So, but in this particular area, or this particular pericope passage of Scripture, what we have is what to do. You get some instructions around married couples. And what Paul, again, you can see the idea that physical and spiritual are connected even inside the marital relationship. You've got Paul saying that physical, sexual activity, that there's instructions about that. And then, but if there is a time where there's not sexual activity, spiritual, I think, what is that verse? Verse 5, do not deprive one another except for perhaps by agreement of a set time to devote yourself to prayer, and that you may not be tempted because you lose a lack of control. But what you find ultimately is that marriage, and this understanding in part, is one more of partnership, and that husbands can't act independently of the wife, and wife can't act independently of the husband. Neither are to be reduced to something for strictly self-gratification. Both parties are to have high regard for the whole marriage, both physical and spiritual, and it is when both parties have this regard that they find the highest satisfaction. So Paul is giving some insight into, because there were some who thought that, well, what we need to do is just abstain from this, maybe because the end is near, or but for some other reason. And Paul is giving some advice and some help into, you know, how that should, what that should be like. Now, Paul does mention in this passage that he would prefer people to be like him. That is a little bit of a gray area with what that means. What we assume is that Paul was married at some point in his life, and that Paul, we assume, had children, and Paul was also part of the Sanhedrin. You might remember some of the stuff going back into Acts. And being part of the Sanhedrin is one couldn't be a member and not be married. Married men were perceived to be more merciful in their actions, and I think you can see some rationale behind that. And so what we think happened, even though we don't have insight into this from the Scripture, is that either Paul's wife died early or that she left him because he became a Christian. Now remember, he wasn't always, he's very adamant in a former way of life. You know, later on, and I think it's in Galatians, I want to say Galatians, but I don't think that's it. He talks about giving everything, maybe Philippians, he gives up everything for the sake of Christ, and this could be something that he's alluding to. So we don't know 100%. John, do you want to comment on it? I know you're kind of not really in here you're kind of helping. But we don't know a lot about Paul's life, but we're making some conclusions and some assumptions about what took place in his life.
Well, then we think he was married.
Pardon me?
Well, then we think he was married. I've never heard that.
Hang on, one at a time. Right.
Suddenly, within the last few years, or I was looking, somebody's decided that he had a perfectly normal life and unfortunately lost it. I mean, why is that?
Well, I mean, part of it is that Paul was a part of things, or I mean, just because the Scriptures don't mention that he has a wife or not have a wife doesn't mean anything. I mean, but he was a...
Put the wife in there, if they don't mention it, who put the wife in there and why?
Well, no, whether or not the wife is in there or not in there, is the Scriptures don't comment either way on it. whether or not someone makes an assumption that he was married or not married, it is nothing more than just an assumption. Paul was a part of things that, for a Jewish male not to be married, that was an anomaly. I mean, to be married and to have children was a sign of blessing from God. Most men wanted to be married and to have children. That was a sign of a continuation of heritage, a continuation of name. And so the idea that someone would have refrained and not be married is a harder stretch to connect than it would be that a natural male would be married and have children.
But I thought his view of marriage was not good, and he said it's better to marry than to burn,
Now, why does he say that? I mean, and he mentions some of this about here. If you cannot,
show yourself.
bingo, then get married. And so, but to start, I mean, it's an easier assumption to assume that Paul was married and had children than it would be not, because the average Jewish person would have been married early.
Is there no history on Paul before that's not in the Bible that would be?
You get, I mean, I've given you summations of it.
But I mean history like some of the very.
No, there's not a, I mean, there are just people writing with assumptions. Keep in mind, the way history was recorded back in that time period is different than the way we do it. And I mean, there wasn't a lot of biographies of people. They just didn't go into that like we do today. And but take out Paul and take out the New Testament, because the New Testament doesn't comment either way whether or not he was married or not married. If he was a typical Jew, he would have been married. That is the base assumption. Not single. Not single.
But you had to be married to be a member of the
You did.
Sanhedrin.
A voting member.
Yes, and he was definitely high up in the
That's exactly right.
Sanhedrin. So they
Which is-
wouldn't have
which is
let
the
him
case-
on unless he'd been married.
Which leads to the fact that the normal assumption for Jewish males is that they would be married, and the fact that he has a high rank inside of their system would even give greater evidence that he would also have been married.
Yes, I think it goes back to his previous life
Right.
at the Sanhedrin.
We're not talking after faith. Now, whatever happened,
No, I'm
whether or
talking about
not,
the fact that he
yeah.
was married.
by the time of writing here, he is not married.
I know.
What
but-
no, I'm in agreement with you. I'm
Okay.
just kind of, I'm expanding the conversation a little bit. By the time of writing this, he is not married. Now, whether or not he is widowed, or whether or not he is been divorced, we don't know.
Well,
But-
he said he liked being single better,
For what reason?
so he could devote himself.
Right, and the thought that the end is near soon. I mean, if I believe, all right, for instance, if I believe, let me ask you this. What do you do if either you're widowed or divorced, and you believe that the end, that Christ is returning soon? All right? Would it be easier to not marry or easier to get married?
You would want to focus on your faith and on Christ, and so it'd be.
Right, I mean, for instance, let's look at it in terms of fasting. If fasting is to abstain from certain practices for a greater purpose, right? Isn't that what we do with fasting?
Yeah.
Roughly, thumbnail sketch. And now we seem to associate fasting with food and drink or something like that. But what if it's abstaining from anything that is okay for you to do, but you abstain from it? If you believe that the clock is ticking and it's not going to be a long time before the bell rings, it's easier to fast and to abstain or deny yourself of certain things, correct? If you've got to skip one meal because it's the clock's going to tick at 5 o'clock, you can skip lunch easier than it would be to fast for 40 days because the time frame is longer, right? All right. So if I believe that the time the bell's going to ring here soon, then I could not me. I mean, I don't want to say like me personally, but it's easier for someone to abstain from a number of things, even marriage. I mean, Paul is not atypical male, right? Which means he's not going to have, sexual urges. I mean, that's a part of human nature, correct? All right, male or female, it exists, right? And so the idea that Paul is superhuman and doesn't have any sexual urges or temptations or worries, be careful there. I guess you could have been a eunuch or so. I mean, that could have, or if it's not women. I mean, I'm not in full disclosure. I don't think this was Paul, but if it's not desire for sexual relationship with a woman, then there's desire for sexual relationship for man or for something else. But the desire is still there, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, Paul is not going to be atypical male. And so to read into Paul, be careful, because you're going to rob him of his own humanity. Now, the teachings for, when we get into later on in chapter 7, and then we're going to take a break, you see a little bit of this. When he talks about married couples, in a minute he's going to talk about the idea that says, if you get married, that's fine. But you need to know something. Your responsibilities have just increased. Because not only do you have to pay attention to your faith, you have to pay attention to your family. All right? And so when he talks about be as me, now, for instance, would your life don't be easier? I'm not saying more fulfilling. Easier if you did not have spouse and did not have children to worry about, and you only had to worry about yourself. Which one is easier? Number three? Yeah, over here. Just you, correct? Right. That's what he's getting at. Right? So the idea is, but he's going to say, if you want to get married, get married. Okay? But you just need to know that you now have responsibilities. And if you have responsibilities, then what you can't do is get married, forsake your spouse and family, and say, I'm only going to focus in on God.
Shane, if you would ask these ladies why they have never remarried, what do you think they're going to tell you?
I'm not even going to begin to That's right. When we take a break, y'all can ask them, and they can answer as they wish. I'm not touching that one with a 10-foot pole. All right, we can take a break. Let's take a break for about 10 minutes or so. A copy of the prayer list. If you have not, please see me afterwards. And does everybody have a copy of the chapter 7 slides? You do not. Okay, are there any extra copies? Can you look around your area? Is there extra copies of chapter 7?
You're talking about I think the camera shot.
I'll get you one, Sally. Oh, we have an extra. Oh, you have extra prayer.
Oh, here's a helping prayer.
Yeah, if you would pass that down this way.
Is there an extra prayer sheet?
I've got an extra prayer sheet right here.
I've got plenty of those, I put one in every book.
Okay, prayer sheet and slides for chapter 7.
Just move to a different.
Becky's got slides and Betty's got prayer sheet. If you need any. All right? Okay, I want to go back and revisit something real quick. Because I think for some, it's whether or not Paul is married or not married is secondary. Okay? That's not going to make, it shouldn't make that big of a difference in, who he was, what he was about, things of that nature. But most men, Jewish men in that day, a sign of blessing was to have children. Okay? That was sort of the plumb line. Think back to the Old Testament, and when you find people who did not have children, all right, and how they see themselves. They see themselves as in that day they saw themselves as not as the same. They're not blessed like those who do have children. It was true of both women and of men. And so the assumption that a man would be single is, that's a big anomaly to what the status quo would have been. And so on Jewish males, the starting place is to assume that they probably were married. And if that they weren't married, then there must have been something majorly wrong with that. Because to not be married in that society would be, you would be seen, now when I say outcast, I don't mean like leper outcast, but you would have been seen as less than among all the other men. Same with women. I mean, go back and look at Samuel's life, Hannah, Sarah, and you just look at a whole bunch of people's lives in the Old Testament. To not be married was one thing, to not be married and to not have children was even worse. And so the assumption is to assume that people were married first, and then to not be married or to be single second.
I
Now,
like the idea of just being married. I think that's easy to understand what you've been
well,
saying.
in that day, now it's a different day for us here, okay? So I mean, you can't, don't take that contextual information and then map it over on our day and say, well, it was true back then, it's true today, because it's not. We live in a different context.
Well, Shane, he's older at this point too.
Right.
I mean, he.
Well, which is why we asked the question that if he would have been a typical male, which leads us to, with a high probability, and not just possibility, high probability that he would have been married, he's not. Well, there's only two ways that you would not be married. Either divorce or widow. And so that's where we come out on. Again, but all of this is assumptions of what we know about the context of that day and the fact that when we meet Paul, he's not married. Now, he could have been single his whole life. All I'm saying is that is a harder case to prove than it would be these other two possibilities. Married and then divorced, and then married, and then she died. I mean, personally, I lean towards married and then divorced because children would have went with their mom.
Children.
Would have went with their mother. Because see, Paul leaves the faith, which means he would have been ostracized inside that community. And so, unless they went with him in the faith, they would have stayed inside the community. If that makes sense. But, yeah, I mean, it's, if you need a PhD project, have at it. I mean, so it's not the, it's good stuff to think about, but whether or not Paul is married or not married when he writes this, it's not that big of a deal.
Well, I think it was that way a while back in our society because if women weren't married, there was something wrong. And then during the First World War, a lot of the men were killed.
Right.
So that limited the number of women that got married. And people usually kind of pitied the old maids. And even in the Second World War, people that weren't married, I mean, they were kind of looked at.
Well, even not just, I mean, I thank you for that. That's great. That's wonderful history. But even today, right, you've got children, grandchildren. If your grandson or granddaughter doesn't get married their entire life, what are your thoughts? Just be honest.
They may be dead.
Pardon me? Yeah, which means what? Not just bless his heart. What does that do? Right. I remember my grandmother, before she passed away, my younger brother was the last one to get married. And, I can remember on a Sunday afternoon, she called him into, can I talk to you, Trey? And she pulled him over into his room and said, I'm not getting any younger. And said, it's about time you settle down. And he's like, oh, wait a minute. But so, it's our time is not near as,
Judgmental.
well, I don't want to go so far that, because I don't want it to be negative.
If it feels good, do it.
Well, we're more open to people being single today. They were not, okay? And so that's the reason why we start there and not start with single.
I didn't even know that,
What?
that it was important to be.
Oh, yeah, well, when you look at the larger view of the Old Testament, that's where we get that from. Right, well, I was waiting for one of y'all to ask that question. Does that mean Jesus was married? That's going to be a later topic. We're not going to go down that just yet. Someone asked a question over here.
He was
see marriages better.
Sure. I mean, they were fixed marriages, which means when a girl was around 12 years old, if she was 14 and she wasn't engaged, that was bad news. And I mean, bride price, all that. Just think back to your history of, what took place in the ancient world and was no different in other societies. I mean, the idea was they got married early, at least the women or the girls did, and to not be married on either side, male or female, was considered, what's going on here. And so, all right, let's move to verse 8. If somebody would read 8 through 16 for us, that would be great. Ma'am?
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
they even might have considered it a sin. And explain Jewish.
Right.
A sin if you were not married.
Right. I mean, it was. Well, go back to Genesis. What's one of the things that are given to Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and multiply. And to not do that in Jewish thought, I mean, you're violating, not like one of the Big Ten, but you're violating just a rule of how they saw society. And so that's the reason why we start with the idea. All that is just gives us a higher probability that he was married at one point. Now we do know. Right. All right. Verse 8. Somebody read verses 8 through 16, please.
Now I say to those who aren't married and to the widows, it's better to stay unmarried, just as I am. But if you can't control themselves, they should go ahead and marry. It's better to marry than to burn with lust. Now, for those who are married, I have a command that comes not from me, but from the Lord. A wife must not leave her husband, but if she does leave him, let her remain single, or else go back to him, and the husband must not leave his wife. Now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. If a Christian man has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she is willing to continue living with him, he must not leave her. And if a Christian woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. For the Christian wife brings holiness to the marriage, and the Christian husband brings holiness to his marriage. Otherwise, your children will not have a godly influence. But now they are set apart from him. But if the husband or wife who isn't a Christian insists on leaving, let them go. In such cases, the Christian husband or wife is not required to stay with them, for God wants his children to live in peace.
Okay. Now keep in mind, part of Paul's view of eschaton is that the end is near. And so that is influencing his thought in this particular, when he's talking about when it comes to relationships. If Christ is going to return and the game is up, that's a heavy on his mind. And so you've got these three people that show up in this particular text. You've got unmarried people, either virgins or widows. Should they be married? Should they not be married? For him, the idea of marriage, because the end is near, if you cannot be married, that allows you to focus only on Christ or focus only on God. Because if you do get married, your responsibilities increase, and if you can't control yourself, really. That's kind of what he says here. If temptation is too much for you, then be married. He talks about married people. The idea is, and he's very orthodox in Jewish understanding and Christian understanding on divorce. Divorce is not good. If they're, again, end is near, it's heavy influencing his thought. Marriage with unbelievers and believers. The idea is that what happens if someone becomes a believer during the marriage, who is able to leave and who is not able to leave. Now, so much of this comes from the Corinth church writing about what do we do in these particular situations. A lot like case law. You know what case law is? Case law is you got a view, Well, how does that play out in all these different situations? And so Paul is weighing in on these very specific situations that are showing up inside of the Corinth area. Now, what's interesting here is that Paul talks a great deal about, in this latter part where you have married believer to unbeliever, that, I mean, the idea of the power of influence amongst people. I was always told growing up that when there is a married believer, or there's a believer who is married to an unbeliever, the one who has greater influence is the unbeliever. Now, I just could be my own upbringing and how twisted that is. But what happens in the text? Yeah, that the one that has the greater influence is the one who belongs to Christ. You know, and that over time, that person can create an environment for unbelieving spouse and children, however they might be, that can win them over, for lack of better words, which is interesting. It's not the believer who is brought into the realm of sin, but the unbeliever who is brought into the realm of grace, is the way some people have described it, and which I think is goes to show you the power of influence inside the life of people, particularly inside the life of a family. So what you do matters inside the family, and it has the utmost opportunity to influence people, influence spouses, influence children, grandchildren, all the way down. But again, Paul is writing, addressing specific issues that are showing up in the Corinth church. Does that make sense? Comments or questions? I want to actually be good and try to get through the text for a change. So let's look now at 17 through 24. If somebody would read that.
However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but obeying the commandments of God is everything. Let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a free person belonging to the Lord. Just as whoever was free when called is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters. In whatever condition you were called, brothers and sisters, there remain with God.
Okay. Thank you. The key to this passage is verse 20. That's sort of the crux of the whole issue. But each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Now the idea is that you in whatever your environment is, you serve God. And I just came out of the context of you're inside of a marriage or inside of a family, and where there might be people who are believing, there might be people who are unbelieving, but you, inside of that context, you live your life a certain way that is influential to other people. Now, what he's doing here is he's left the marriage context and made it larger into a more general discussion that says wherever you are at, you serve. And you serve in a way that influences others. And so he gets larger than just the family relationship or the family example. He starts talking about whether or not you're circumcised or uncircumcised, whether or not you're slave or whether or not you're free. You know, in the ancient world, in the Roman world, slaves could buy their freedom. I mean, it was hard, but they could. And what they would do is they would earn enough money Actually, sometimes owners would lend their slaves out to other people, and the owner would get a cut from the income, and they would get the lion's portion, and then the slave would retain a certain part of the money. But over time, a slave could, it's hard to do, a slave could earn enough money to buy their freedom. And the way they would do that is they would go down to the local temple, whatever temple it would be, and they would go to the priest, and they would give the money to the priest, and the priest would go give the money to the owner and say that the God has bought the slave. So the God is free to you, but now belongs to God, to that God, little g. You with me? All right? And so there were times when people could buy their freedom. It's very difficult to do, and it normally took almost a lifetime of money, just because the wages were so low. But you did have that. Now what's interesting though is the way the transaction took place. They would not, the slave wouldn't go and give it to the owner and say, I'm free. They would have to give it to a mediator, and the mediator would conduct the transaction. But whoever gave the money to the owner, they became the new owner of the person. Free in the Roman society, but still belonged to God. Now, Paul takes that whole analogy or that picture and picks up on it in verse 23. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters. So you got this idea that all of us were bought by Christ, and so we belong to Him. Does that make sense? Do you see the analogy of what Paul is getting at there? Which is interesting. That if that is the case, and He is the master or the owner, and we are the servant, then we act, live, we breathe according to His bidding. Now, the question can be asked: do you really believe it? I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, I belong to Christ, but I mean, are you a slave to Christ? A servant? Which means you don't control who you are. I don't mean like a robot, but I mean the idea is that you operate as if I belong to Him. That's the language.
You should.
That's right. I mean, it's hard. I mean, when we go into the Gospels, remember we spend a big deal about talking about the kingdom of God? And the idea is that you're going to live in a kingdom, which means you're not going to be the king or going to be the ruler, which means you're a subject, a citizen in that kingdom. But ultimately, you serve in a kingdom, one or the other. And that's interesting. It's hard to it's been my experience that is hard to process for autonomous people. And the more autonomy you have, the harder it is. Which is when we fast forward into the New Testament, and you look at the critiques that Jesus had against the religious leaders that had a lot of autonomy, or the wealthy, or the powerful, and then you compare His words and actions towards those groups to groups that are the opposite of that, it's different. But it goes back to this. You can't get away from who you're going to serve. And so, do we really, I mean, I know we know the answers. We've been to church, been to Sunday school, we got all that, okay? You come here every Tuesday. I know you know the answers, right? But when it comes to fully operating and living out your life, who ultimately is going to tell you what to do? That's different. All right? And if you want to know how well you're doing at it, how loving are you? Not with the people that are easy to love. How loving are you with the people who are not, who are not lovable? Now, that'll tell you where you sit. Now, you don't have to be a servant. You don't. Not to this one. But if you do, and if I do, we all play according to his rules, and they're not open for picking and choosing. Does that make sense? Which is interesting. Probably could stop here. It's kind of sobering.
Yeah, it's easy and it's not easy.
Sure. Now, the good news is that, we haven't talked about how you do that and the role of the Holy Spirit, things of that nature. But what the Holy Spirit, what God never does is violate somebody's will. All right? You see that all throughout Scripture. All right? People do have a choice. All right? And, we're going to look at Exodus. The language says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. That's a style of writing in the Old Testament that God, where the writer is saying, well, God just let Pharaoh determine his own actions. I mean, he didn't violate that. And the same thing shows up inside of our own life. I mean, did God make you a Christian?
No.
No, exactly right. Does God make anybody a Christian? Right. I mean, so there's influence, things of that nature, and we've already looked at that, and some of it in chapter 7, how your influence can make the jump to Christianity or the jump to faith easy, but in the end, what you sign up for is to be a servant. And it doesn't matter, what denomination. I mean, this is basic Christian theology, and it's hard because it's easy when it's easy, or when it's easy when everybody plays nice. But what happens when it's hard for people, when it's hard for you to love? Notice that forgiveness is not optional. And if we really did some studies on the whole concept of forgiveness, and that for us, I think, if I had to pick one issue that's hard for our day and our society, I'm going to say it's the forgiveness issue. Because behind the whole issue with forgiveness is the idea of who ultimately is control. I mean, who ultimately is in control. And if I'm in control, then I can determine who I want to love. I can determine who I want to forgive. I can determine, how I want to act. And when you look at it in the New Testament, what shows up is, one, it's an assumption in some parts of the New Testament. In other parts, it is a command, but it's never optional. And so you get language, even when Jesus is talking, it says, the measure by which you forgive is what? Right. And he's talking about our actions to other people, and then God's actions to us. So it's not just, God, don't worry about the forgiveness you get from God, how we deal with other people. That's really what he's talking about. No. If you look at what Jesus is talking about in that passage, he's talking about God's forgiveness of us, and then our willingness to live as a servant doing the same thing. Wow. Now, I'd like it better, we just all got the free pass, and then we can just kind of reconcile with ourselves. That's not what shows up. Which all that does is underpin this. We're all servants. The word there is, it gets translated servants in some Bibles, slaves in the other. You can interpret how you want. But the issue ultimately is control. I mean, which is why when we first started, we looked at this. How you see God, determines how you act. Now, this doesn't mean perfection, okay? So don't just because we put God up, God in the process of this, we're not talking about perfection. But if we were to scope our life, or if we were to look at the process of our life, we would see ourselves becoming more and more like Christ. And for me, in our day and age, what's the easiest plumb line to determine where we're at on that is how loving are we. And it's not with the people that are easy to love. I mean, anybody can do that. It's with the people who are difficult, who get under your skin, who drive you crazy, who cause your blood pressure to go up. I mean, how do you act with them? All right? I mean, you know, it is.
Try
I mean,
not
you know,
to be around them.
you what?
Try to avoid them. You try to avoid them.
All right? But sooner or later, you got to deal with the root of the issue. So, you know, you know, if you think about it, now what happens? Let's talk about how profitable this can be. What happens when we do the work that is needed to get to where on the inside of us it's easier to be more loving? Talk about the level of anxieties you feel. Talk about the levels of I mean, you can look at it in terms of joy, in terms of happiness, in terms of life satisfaction. I mean, think about it on that term. When your relationships are good, how do you classify your life? Good. Bliss. All right? And that's not a financial indication. All right? So, I mean, so I'm talking about, you know, that's why I think for us, if somebody's going to write about us and they're going to study it 2,000 years later, it might not be the issue of what are we doing with our body and sex. It might be how we treat each other. Which is why for us in our day, particularly in Western society, where there is a lot of autonomy inside of our culture. We do. And inside the United States, we have even more than anybody else. This is the top of the food chain, okay? And so by far. So what do you do when you have a choice to serve or not? That's the first question. And it's hard. Which, when you get Jesus talking about this, he says, when you want to be great, you be the least. When, you know, when he's given a description in Mark's gospel, there's 3 different times he gives a description of what it means to be a suffering servant. And they show up in kind of this parallelism that takes place in Mark's gospel. All of them have to do with this idea of taking a cross, follow me, forsake yourself to save it. If you want to be great, you've got to be the least. What he's getting at is this. And it's hard. So, but I mean, that's what's expected, required. That's life in the kingdom. Now it's a process, okay? Don't go out of here and think, oh my gosh, I got all these people, you know, and make your list, and I don't like them, and they get on my skin. I'm not talking about, I mean, don't go home and beat yourself up, and you know, I'm not talking about all that. But over your life, in time, are you becoming a more loving person towards people? All right? That'll tell you how well you're doing when it comes to being a servant.
Shane, does it count if you actually love the person, but you don't necessarily like what they have done?
All right. Yeah, I mean, you know, let's define what we mean by, real quick, what we mean by what loving is.
It's like, you can forgive but not forget.
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to, if somebody has hurt you, okay, let me tell you what love is not, and it'll never, ever, 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 ever be this, okay? So, and we do a horrible job teaching this in the church. We do. Love never means that you can kind of download and erase where things have happened to you. That is so, all right, I'm going to use a word. I'm not calling you this. I'm calling that thought this. That is asinine. It is. I mean, the idea that thinks that someone did something to me or I did something to myself, that you're going to be able to erase that from your history, that's asking you to not be a person. All right? And so, you know, that's not what we're getting at when we say loving, okay? But you know whether or not you want to love somebody or not. Don't make this harder than what it is. All right? Nobody has to tell you that if, you know, pass or fail, if I had my, you know, if it was up to me, you know, I mean, I'd stick it to them. I mean, you know, will you favor goodness for them? I mean, do you pray for them? I don't mean pray they get hit by a bus. I mean, do you pray? Do you want God to, you know, are you interested in their wholeness? That'll tell you where you sit on it. All right? I mean, you know, should you, I mean, does loving mean that I've got to enjoy when other people do bad things? No, that's not love. That's not the way you see love now. I mean, go home with, you know, your children or your spouse. If it, you know, I don't know how it works in y'all's house, but in the Green household, you know, it ain't always perfect. This morning, I mean, going to school, thought my son wasn't going to make it. So, I mean, you know, does that change my how I see him, how I care about him, my desires for him? No. Do I like it when he doesn't do his homework and get a 0? Absolutely not. Right? I mean, you know, so don't try to parse this into, you know, a laundry list or a pecking order that says, okay, I'm going to climb up the ladder, and this is the pass-fail number, and I'm right here, and that's all I want to be. That makes me pass, but man, I surely don't want to overachieve on this one. This guy's a rat. You know, that'll tell you something. I mean, that'll tell you where you're at. You know, can you favor goodness for them? I mean, would you want God to do in their life what God has done in your life? That'll tell you. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to go and eat dinner with them all the time. This doesn't mean that they're going to be number one on your call list, and you know, don't. Right? That's not love. Okay? Love is a choice that you make to favor these people. All right? That doesn't mean you're going on vacation. Okay? It's not. And it might, you know, don't make how you love someone reconciliation, how you love someone, forgiving. Keep in mind, those are two different steps. Forgiveness has to do with you and God. Reconciliation has to do with you and another person. And when there's been something in the relationship that has broken that, both things would be great if they happen, but forgiveness is something you control with God. That's a you and God thing. It has nothing to do with the other person. And we don't get that. We want forgiveness when they come and I'm sorry and restitution. We want forgiveness because we want to control it. Reconciliation is you and the other person. And you can forgive the other person and you can want to love the other person, but if they do not want to reconcile, there is nothing you can do. So don't confuse all that. You know, we've just done a horrible job in the church. I'm going to speak on behalf of the clergy. We should do a better job trying to explain how that shows up in the Bible and explain how that shows up in relationships. I mean, we're good at giving what I call these just Christian cliches, and it becomes burdens. I mean, it'd be like you telling your children at day one, here are the keys, and they can't even reach the pedals. I mean, you want to send your child out to drive a car and they can't even see over the steering wheel and touch the pedals? I mean, why would we say to somebody, well, you just got to love everybody because that's just what God does. And we don't even talk about what that means. I mean, you know, that's crazy.
I just remember Charles Stanley.
All right, one at a time.
I just remember Charles Stanley in a sermon saying, when you have a hard time forgiving somebody, to pray good things would happen in their life.
Sure, I mean.
Eventually the whole spirit changed.
Well, because what happens is the prayer then is not so much for them as much as for it is for you. I mean, you know, could you listen? Try to go home and pray for somebody that you're angry with and pay attention to what's going on inside of your own life. That's what's going to come to the forefront. Because what will happen is, in your, you know, you can cry out to God, but it's not going to be long before you're going to find a finger being poked back on your own life that says, well, let's wait a minute. I already know what they've done. Let's think about what you've done. Go ahead.
No, I was
interested in the love part, because I get confused sometimes.
Why do you
Follow him. Well, I don't want to go down under the bridge and talk to him.
Okay, all right, so, all right, you're, okay. Let's hold that for, I don't mean to, what I'm saying, you know, loving someone, you know, talk about in terms of circles, okay? Let's just say the people who are close to you, all right? This is Shane, you know, start here, all right? Make sure that's good. You know, because what'll happen is, you know, if you get these right, you know, it's easier on the fringes, you know. Does that make sense? I mean, and loving doesn't mean that, don't think, you can be very loving and not go on a mission trip. Does that make sense? I mean, you know, so don't assume that pecking order is kind of like what I'm talking about, that, well, in order to be loving, I've got to be super Christian up here who's better than everybody else. And I be careful there. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah.
I don't think you don't have to go.
Well, what we're going to say is right now. But the goal is one step beyond caution. Okay? And if there is something that stands out that says, God, I cannot stand doing this, that probably tells you something right there. Spend time with that. Why? Why is the best question you can ask yourself? It's the worst question you can ask somebody else. Because when you ask somebody else, it puts them on they got to explain their actions. But the best question in reflective prayer that you can ask yourself is, why either do I want to do this or why that I don't want to do this? That'll tell you a great deal. And there's a whole section of prayer, those little white books that we put around that say methods of prayer. There's one of them that focuses on what I call the negative first, not the positive. Why? I mean, if I have a hard time with a certain type of person or a certain type of people, then why is that? That'll tell a great deal about me, not so much about them. Does that make sense? And it's just a method of prayer. So you know, why do I hold this thought? Okay, because of this. All right, ask that why there. I mean, you know, all this does is start to peel back layers of the onion till you get to the real issue behind it. Now, be careful, because when you peel it back, kind of like ripping the scar back, you'll see something you might not like. All right, I know we're late. Go in peace. May the Lord be with you.